The governing body, before we go into communications from the board, I wanted to ask for a motion, or I'm going to ask for a motion. This regards the executive session of the council last month that made it out into the public, and there was some concern over the council's right to be able to discuss the items that were discussed under the executive session rules. So in an effort to open up those discussions and to be able to address concerns that were brought forward by information that was pushed out, I'd like to move to waive the attorney-client privilege for the sole purpose of authorizing the city attorney to disclose her basis for recommending on December 10th, 2014, that the governing body go into executive session specifically with respect to the Interfaith Homeless Shelter at 2801 Cerrillos Road. So I make that in the form of a motion, and then we can discuss. There's a second.
Second for purposes of discussion.
Okay. So the idea, obviously, through this is to be able to allow the public to get access to all the information as it related to the interfaith shelter on that evening. Kelly, maybe you can elaborate more.
But are we going into executive session to do that?
No.
No. This is really for a very limited purpose. It's not to discuss the discussion. It's not to discuss what was discussed in the executive session, but merely to give the basis for going into executive session specifically.
Give the basis, but I also want to waive. We also want to make available, which we have, whatever was discussed on that in executive session, make available to the public.
The document that I'll be referring to is already in the public record name.
Okay. The document that was discussed in executive session. Okay, got it. All right. Questions? Councilor Boucher?
I'm not sure I understand what we're voting on here this evening. I mean, what document are you making? The agenda that you had in the executive session that was not labeled attorney-client privilege available to the public? And can we not have this discussion right now out in the public?
Mayor, councilors, Councilor Boucher, I would not recommend entering into the discussion in the public. I think that probably you missed part of the discussion that evening. The question that was raised by Fogg and others was that whether we had any basis for even going into executive session. And I'm going to say that we did have a basis, and I can't explain why unless the privilege is waived to allow me specifically to say that.
But what I'm trying to get at is I would prefer, and one of the reasons I missed some of the discussion and I left and I made a record with Melissa, I said let the record reflect, I'm leaving this meeting less and less comfortable with the topics being discussed. I did not feel like they should be discussed behind closed doors. I think it's important to remedy, and I think that was part of the letter that Fogg wrote, that we have that discussion out in public. So I'm hopeful that with this waiver, it's not just going to allow you to talk, but that we can all talk about why we were in executive session and if we thought we should have been.
This does, if it's passed, does certainly allow for any member of the governing body to talk on the issue regarding the interfaith homeless shelter.
But, I mean, that's not going to be this discussion here this evening?
No, because well, first of all, we've got 2 minutes until we move to 7, so we're gonna go into a public hearing fairly shortly. Second, if we're going to talk about it, we should properly notice it so that the public knows we're going to talk about it, and they could be here to listen to the conversation.
Okay, so is that part of the motion, or can that be part of the motion?
No, the motion right now is specifically to waive the attorney-client privilege.
How do we take it to the next step to get it on?
We need to get through this one first. This item specifically to waive the attorney-client privilege. Let's move down, we're gonna go across this way, right? So Councilor Rivera.
Just, Kelly, what does this waiver do that whoever talked to the press hasn't already given them? It sounds like they had all the information that we already spoke about anyway, which brought all the issues up.
Mayor, councilors, Councilor Rivera, it will allow me to say what the basis for going into executive session was. It was a general citation. New Mexico FOG asserted that it was their understanding that we didn't have any basis for the discussion, and I would clarify what that basis was. And I would say that when you waive the privilege, you waive a very specific thing. You are not waiving anything but the thing that you waive. I would not want to get into waiving substance of the discussion. I've had a number of counselors say to me that they were concerned because they felt they needed to be able to speak frankly to the issues without feeling they were going to read about it in the newspaper the next day. So I would just say that when you waive the privilege, you waive it as to a very specific thing. The mayor's motion was very specific. And that's, if you want to make another motion subsequently to discuss everything that was in there, that's a different thing entirely.
Thank you.
Hey, Councilor Dominguez.
Thank you, Mayor. I stand in support of the motion. I understand that we need to be able to waive that privilege first. I guess this is specific to this item, correct?
That's correct, Counselor. It is not a waiver of everything that was discussed in the session, of any other documents that were discussed in the session. It is a specific thing. And in fact, the document that I will be discussing is a public document and has been subject of an error.
So again, I support the motion, Mayor. I understand what it is that is being done, and I understand why. I guess one word of caution is that if we are going to truly, in the future, protect taxpayer money and protect our rights with those attorney-client privileges, we need to be careful not to necessarily set a precedent, because there are going to be instances where, although it's fruitful for the public to have knowledge, we need to be able to do the work that we need to be able to do in executive session as well, to protect the public's interests as well. So I just make that word of caution that we should not, ought not set a precedent necessarily, and that we be diligent in not only this proceeding but future proceedings.
Thank you. Next question, Councilor Abson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Kelly, I want to just draw a distinction which, based upon the discussion, I'm not clear, is clear. That being, the motion as made by the mayor and seconded by me is to waive the attorney-client privilege as to specifically why executive session was appropriate in the instance. And that distinction I draw is that is very different than waiving the privilege with regards to the discussion itself. So this motion is merely to allow you to advise the public the basis for the assertion of executive privilege, attorney-client privilege in that context. It is not an authorization for anybody on the governing body to discuss what was discussed in that meeting. And I'm happy to have that discussion. I think it would be important perhaps at our next meeting to go into executive session to discuss whether or not there is an inclination or desire to waive the privilege with regards to the particular discussion, but that's not what we're considering at this point in time. Is that correct?
Mayor, councilors, Councilor Ives, that's correct. And if you look at the handout, you'll see that the waiver of attorney-client privilege or other privilege requires a majority of the whole. It's in the governing body rules. And anyone can make a motion at any time, whether in executive session or after executive session. And the governing body can vote on it. But the distinction you make is absolutely the distinction that I was making earlier.
And I do appreciate that. My hope is that, because I think there's been a lot of discussion out there in terms of what was discussed in executive session, that we can move at some point in a short order to open up what was actually discussed. And we'll follow the proper.
Yeah, and if I may, Mr. Mayor, I think given it was in that context that it's important for us to hear from the city attorney counsel on that particular issue, which is why I suggest maybe an executive session at our next regularly scheduled meeting to do exactly that.
Councilor Mestis?
Yes, I stand in support of the motion as well. But I must admit, I was uncomfortable when the subject was raised in executive session. And obviously, we're going to hear again what the basis was for discussing it, which was explained in executive session. But I will state for the record, I thought the basis was tenuous, but I still felt like it was justified. And then lastly, I want to echo what Councilor Dominguez said. I think attorney-client privileges, it's really up there with our fiduciary duties as elected officials. And I think that a full admonishment ought to be considered in the future. And I realize, Councilor Dominguez, your remarks were cautionary, but I really think that this could really cause a lot of problems. In fact, I think we've resorted to do this to kind of set the record straight in the spirit of transparency and reiterate the basis for discussing that topic. So, so I just echo what Councilor Dominguez said.
Let me just really quick clarify, reiterate what you indicated, because I think it's an important education tool for all of us that are up here. If at any point there is a discussion going on in executive session that a counselor or I say, no, wait, we're uncomfortable with this, and feel that this doesn't qualify, you've stated that they can say, or in fact, it could be our obligation to actually make a motion to stop the discussion and to move it outside. And by a majority of the council decision in there, that stops and it moves outside. Is that correct?
Mayor, councilors, that's correct.
Okay, so it's upon us individually to own up to our own responsibilities as elected officials to stop the discussion that's going on and to be able to try and move, which that was not done during the executive session at the last, when we were in executive session. So I just want to make sure that it was good for me to understand that, because I do want to be able to know that there is a discussion that's going on that I don't agree with or I think should be outside. I want to be able to pose that to the council and to ask that it be stopped through some formality. I do also want to make sure that we go back to what we had started, and that is making sure that we are listing items that we are discussing in executive session for the public, so that we don't find ourselves coming back out of this. And it's just something that you and I need to make sure that we're, and Yolanda, that we're able to post to the program. Okay, roll call. On the motion.
Councilor Boucher?
Yes.
Councilor Dominguez?
Yes.
Councilor Rice?
Yes.
Councilor Lindell?
Yes.
Councilor Maestas?
Yes.
Councilor Rivera?
Yes.
Councilor Trujillo?
Yes.
Mayor Gonzalez?
Yes.
Motion
Mayor,
carried.
you didn't call on me, but I would like to say that I do believe that it's incumbent upon the city attorney's office to actually be more clear about what we are listing as items that go in executive session. I had a discussion with the city attorney before that was listed, once we received a confidential attorney-client privilege memo with regard to the topic, and challenged her at the time about why we would go into executive session. And so I would just say that I will be bringing forward, after I work with Common Cause and perhaps the League of Women Voters, some changes to really tighten up how we are going to use the Open Meetings Act. I think it's incumbent upon us to be as clear, crystal clear, as we can be about why we're going into executive session. And I know it's fairly liberal in its interpretation. I've been here to see many a city attorney, I think, misuse that provision. So I would suggest that we need to rely on the advice of the city attorney's office first and foremost.